Hey team, I wanted to take a few minutes and walk you through the um, PowerPoint presentation for Chapter 10, which covers ethics from the Effective Grant Management textbook by, or not even really a textbook, but a guide by Deborah Ward. Unfortunately, there's not a whole lot of substance to this particular chapter, but I will take you through what they do talk about in this particular chapter. So let's dig right in. The first part has to do with applicants, grantees, funders, funds, match, and in-kind. And as an active grant seeker, myself, as someone who has given away grants and managed those grants, I would love to tell you that everything's above board, there are no ethical violations, nothing funky happens, but that's not really true. There are some things that happen at a much higher level, like identifying people for grants before it's even become a competitive solicitation. That happens really at much bigger levels, like at the federal level. But for us, for dealing with nonprofit grants or even small grants, state grants, local grants, that sort of thing, these are some of the common issues we're going to run into. So ethics doesn't just apply to a grant manager, it really applies to the whole process and all the people who are involved in it. So you can think, well, okay, there's ethics that applies to the applicant, which is you, um, or the person who manages the grant, the person who provides the funding, and also there are certain stipulations surrounding the use of matches. So again, a match is something that the grantee brings to the table. It can be cash, it can be in kind. And so we'll talk about each of those briefly. So the first one has to do with the applicant. That's who's applying for the money. In my opinion, there are varying degrees of ethical violations. So one that's sort of at the low end is applying for a grant that you know you're not really capable of doing. And this happens, the best analogy I can think of is like the new suit that you want to buy that you know you really can't afford and that you don't really have anywhere to wear it to. Well, we all see grant solicitations for $1 million and it seems really attractive, and you might be able to stretch your particular area of expertise or what your organization is doing to apply for the money, but honestly that clogs the system. It clogs the system for people who are truly prepared to provide those services or do that program. And I advise against it. Your chance of actually being successful is extremely low. You're going to put in a ton of time putting the application together, and then you harm other probably more qualified grant applicants by putting in something that you're really not prepared for. Now the grantee, this is the person who actually gets the funds. There are obviously tons and tons and tons of ethical restrictions. And typically when we talk about ethics in other classes, I tell my students, hey, this is pretty simple, right? There's right and wrong and maybe a couple little gray areas here and there, but for the most part, you should be able to figure out what ethical behavior looks like. Unfortunately, with grants, it's not quite that simple. And I mean, of course, there is right and wrong. Don't steal money, that sort of thing. But let me give you an example. When I started out as a grant administrator, I hadn't had a ton of training. I had, I would say, a mentor, and I worked with her for about 3 months. But the training that I needed at the federal level, because I was working as a grant administrator at the federal level at the time, they couldn't get me into a slot, whatever it was. So I was actually functioning as an actual grant administrator for the federal government, and I hadn't had all of the training. I've been given access to the OMB circulars, but you've seen those things. Not the best bedtime reading. So I went through them. I thought I understood it. I'd gone to some state trainings and I felt pretty comfortable. And pretty much every expenditure that our sub-grantees had from our federal money, I had to approve those expenditures. And so one came across my desk, and it was for a banquet primarily for volunteers for this agency. Now that is an allowable expense, so I wasn't in trouble there. The problem was that there were probably 30 to 35, maybe even 40% of the people who were at the luncheon who were not volunteers. They were either state employees or they were employees of some of the partners of the particular grantee, and that was a very serious problem. And I honestly didn't know. I wasn't trying to create an issue or do something that I wasn't supposed to do. I just didn't know the rule about that entirely. So I send my signed invoice up to the people who take care of that. I immediately get a notice that I have violated policy. That notice has to go to the federal government. They had to come into an investigation. I mean, it kind of turned into this big, huge ordeal for, honestly, I think it was $3,000. So, of course, I got a letter of warning, which is fine. I mean, I did something wrong. I wasn't educated enough to, properly review the materials that I had in front of me. So I took that. So sometimes that stuff happens. And that's why it's extremely important to really move beyond the paradigm of right and wrong and understand the very intricate rules that apply to all grants. Now, at the federal level, they're all going to be the same. And they're pretty much all going to be outlined in the OMB circulars. Not all nonprofits follow those rules, but a lot kind of in spirit do go by those rules. That's why I put up the actual article that I did for this week. Because one of the things that we see is that if you have a federal grant, whether you like it or not, you're going to be very, very transparent about what happens with that grant. You'll have grant people who will come and visit you. You have people who will come and audit you, whether you've done anything or not, or whether they think that you have. You have meetings with meeting notes. Those notes get sent up to someone in the federal government. It's an open book. There's really nowhere to hide. Now, I shouldn't say that, because if you found some examples of real world people who actually steal federal money, it does happen, but it's much more difficult because there are really eyes on you all the time. In the nonprofit sector, we see less of that. You don't have a federal, grant manager who oversees all the titles, who funding, who's going to be combing through every monthly report and every invoice. You simply don't have that level of oversight. And I believe that almost 99% of all nonprofits are there to actually help and not do, they're not there to do anything wrong. Just the simple nature of how they operate can make it a little bit easier. So if you do have that one bad apple in your group, it can make it a lot easier for them to say, extort funds, to use funds inappropriately, maybe buy themselves a pair of Bronco tickets, who knows. So that's really the key point of that article, is that just the nature of nonprofits makes them a little bit more susceptible to ethical violations. Now let's talk about match and in-kind. This is the last little piece here. If you have a project where you put in a budget and you ask the agency that you're applying to, we need $300,000. We ourselves have $100,000 in cash that we can put into the project, and then we have an in-kind contribution of volunteers or equipment or whatever else it may be of another $100,000. Well, that's wonderful. It's my firm belief that any application should have some skin in the game. Right? You should be able to say, well, we can do this. If you can give us this amount, we'll come up with the rest of it. However, in the last 10 years, all funders, whether they be nonprofits or federal or corporate giving, they've really cracked down on in-kind matches. And you have to prove that you actually did that, because for a long time people would put in there, oh yeah, we're going to have 100 volunteer hours, which equals roughly $23,000 worth of match. Well, there was never a volunteer to be found. So now you have to do a lot more in terms of proving that you actually have that match. Whereas before, people quite unethically just simply lied that they had a match, and they didn't. Or they lied about the in-kind portion when they knew that, well, we'll try and get some volunteers, but if we don't, we don't. That is a stated part of the budget. If you don't have it, then that's a violation. So just be careful with those matches. And that's really about the end of the ethics slideshow. I do want you to read that article that I posted, and I really would like you to try and find some real life examples. And you can find them from all over the spectrum. You can find people who were those bad apples, and they were simply stealing money. There's no other way to put it. They were stealing money. And then you have examples, mine, for example, where I simply didn't have the knowledge I needed to do my job appropriately. And then there's everything in between. There are people who have absolutely no training and shouldn't be doing any kind of grant management. And you have people who, I guess, make a decision for the greater good, even though they know it violates a policy. And I can tell you at the federal level, they don't really care if you made a decision for the greater good. If it's wrong, it's wrong. If they think you did it out of ignorance, they'll give you a warning. If you did it because you thought you were doing something for the greater good, they're going to arrest you. And I'm sure some of you have found some actual examples already where people have gone to jail. So I kind of use that. It's a little bit of a joke, but at the same time, it's not a joke. People do actually end up in prison for some of these violations, these ethical violations with grants. So my best advice to you is to educate yourself as much as possible. I know that OMB Super Circular looks like something, you would probably burn during the winter, but you really do need to read it. It's not going to apply always, exactly across federal and nonprofits, but the principles contained there really do apply across all kinds of grants or projects that you might be managing. So it's a really good place to start. And honestly, it'd be pretty tough to get into trouble if you're abiding by those OMB circular rules. There aren't going to be many extra rules from, say, a corporate giver that you wouldn't see in the OMB circular. So that brings to a conclusion our presentation on ethics, and I hope you guys have a great week. This concludes the content that needs to be loaded for Unit 5, and I really hope you take advantage. Have a great week. Bye-bye.